It's that process. It's that motivation. It's that process. Got the V6 waiting. What is up, guys? Thanks for tuning in. Today we have a 3.2 liter V6 motor off of the TL, and I'm going to be go ahead and changing the timing belt because the timing belt is damaged and it does have a split in it. And once I remove these covers as well as the crank pulley bolt and take all that stuff off, I'll be showing you exactly why I'm replacing this timing belt. And another reason why I'm replacing the timing belt, if you guys don't know how difficult V6 motors can be when they're in the vehicle, it's best to do the timing belt now while the motor is out of the vehicle. So let's jump right into it. Okay, so first we're going to remove the top covers. There's a couple bolts on the top, so there's roughly 5 bolts on each of the covers that go over the camshafts, and there's at least a dozen bolts for the bottom crank pulley bolt cover. So I'll go ahead and I'll take off the covers. Now you want to remove the crank pulley bolt. If you have a harmonic balancer tool, you can use that. If not, use an impact. I strongly suggest a powerful impact, something like a Milwaukee. So I'm going to be using a Milwaukee, and I'm going to go ahead and tear down everything you need to tear down, as well as that post mount, and then we'll get right into the timing. All right, so now we have the cam covers off. So we have those off. So like I said, there's a couple bolts. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5, which is right in the middle. Same thing over here. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. I don't have the power steering set up. I'm doing a power steering delete. This is going in the EG hatch, so I'm not going to be using any of that. I'm just going to run a shorter belt just from the crank pulley to the alternator. So I'll have a video on that later on. But as for now, we have these covers off. So the next step, I would take the power steering pump off if you want to. It gives you more room. You may be able to get away without removing it, but after you do this, you want to disconnect this mount. So you have 2 bolts up top, so go ahead and take those 2 bolts out. This bolt goes into the motor mount on the chassis. Make sure you take that out. If you need to use a jack to lift up the motor, if you're doing this in the motor, then you can put a piece of 2x4 underneath the jack and then lift up the motor, and then you should be able to have that jack support the engine. So with that said, after you take out those 2 bolts, you have 1, 2, 3. I believe those are 14mm bolts as well. So go ahead and take out those 14mm bolts so we can have greater access to the area. So I'll do that now. Okay, so these 3 bolts are loose. They 14mm bolts. Go ahead and loosen those. You're not going to be able to remove them out because it's kind of sitting behind. See, it's sitting behind your cover. So we have to remove the cover first. So we're going to break loose this crank pulley bolt with a Milwaukee. And it's a 19mm bolt for the crank pulley. And it should just zip right out. Let's see if I can get this for you. So, Milwaukee does it every frickin' time, my guys. Don't cheap out and then complain and cry when you can't get that bolt loose. Just invest in the expensive material and it'll make your life a lot easier. So now that I have that off, I'm going to remove the crank pulley, and then I'm going to go ahead and take apart these 10mm bolts. There's a bunch of bolts all over the place, so we'll go ahead and we'll take them all off. So I'll do that now, and I'll show you where the placement of these bolts are by referencing the timing chain cover. Okay, so we have the timing cover off. We have 1 bolt there, another one in the middle, another one on the side of that arrow, another one there, one in the bottom left, one in the bottom right, one in the middle, and then again the one on the top right. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bolts that hold this bottom cover on. Should come loose. And then once you have it loose, you have this mount here. Like I said, now you should be able to remove it. You have the bolts in there. Keep them in their areas, the designated areas, and don't lose it. That way you can keep your bolts intact. as well as this plate here. Make sure you assemble it the same way you disassemble it. Don't forget this, it's kind of like a shim, but just go ahead and make sure, like I said, you put it back the same way you found it. So we'll go ahead and we'll take this out, put it along there. Okay, so now we have our timing belt, and the reason I'm replacing it is because it is worn down. Let me show you one key area that I was like, oh yeah, I gotta replace this. Alright, so the camera's not really focusing here, but if you guys can see it right here, you see that crack? That's a crack in the belt. And if you're shifting hard in this and you end up snapping your belt, it's not going to be a pretty outcome. So that's why I'm like, you know what, before I swap this motor into the new spot that it's going to go into, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to replace this timing belt. Plus it's really like loose. I didn't really like that, so it's definitely worn out. I mean, it's got its tension on the tensioners, well, that's safe to say, but still fairly loose. I'm not a fan of that. So it should be a little bit tighter than that. Not much, but that to me is too loose. So I could stretch it out that much. So I said I'm gonna replace it. So that's the plan. I'm gonna go ahead and replace it. And yeah, so let's go ahead and do this. So we're gonna set it up with top dead center, which is going to be your cams. They should be facing upwards. So we're gonna put cylinder number 1. It's going to meet this line here. So I'm gonna use a paint marker and do all that, but you'll see here the cylinder number 1, there's a notch right there, cylinder number 1, and there's another notch there. So when cylinder number 1 is aligned with this, it should be at top dead center. So we'll check that, and then we'll also check the other cam and make sure that also corresponds with the other head. So make sure that these are timed correctly, and then we're going to move on to the bottom half and make sure that that is also top dead center, which it should be because the motor was running and driving prior to me pulling this motor. So we're just going to put it at top dead center, remove the belt, and then replace it, and the water pump and all the idler pulleys and tensioners and things of that nature. So let's jump into it. No days off, papi chulitos. Papi chulitos, tú lo sabes. No days off. So, you know, when I see this motor and I see the hatch, I go, just take my fucking money. Alright, so before you remove the timing belt, like I said, you want to time everything before you remove everything, or just be a little bit harder on yourself to retime everything. So why not just put it top dead center, remove everything, and put on the new parts. So let me show you what you need to do before you remove the timing belt. Make note that the rotation of this motor is clockwise. I know other motors like the Honda Prelude, the H22 or H23, they move counterclockwise. So just take note of that. The J series swaps, they rotate clockwise, so to the right. So turn your motor to the right and get this lined up. So you have that line on the crankshaft. You have that number 1. I painted it a little bit too much, but that's a number 1. And you have a notch on the camshaft. See if I can get this to focus. So yeah, you can see that little notch on the tooth. And then you also see a notch there. So just looking at that right there, that is good. That lines up perfectly. So that is timed. Same thing with this one. There's a notch, there's another line, and that's facing directly up. And then now we're gonna move down. Excuse me. To your crank pulley. So just make note, we're just gonna follow these tracks here. If you see your crank pulley chuck or your safety pin, locking pin, just follow that. If you follow that, let's see if I can get this to focus. Yep, there is an arrow right there, filled in with green. Follow that cam on the top. We'll straight up, and there's your arrow on the oil pump. So that's gonna align with the cam gear. The crank gear, I'm sorry. And that's pretty much it. Once you have that done, then you can go ahead and loosen the tension and start replacing the belt. So let's do that now. Okay, so we have our auto tensioner, which is this thing right here. It has two 10mm bolts, and it sits right there like so, and it sits on this tensioner like that. Probably the other way. But with that said, you take off those two 10mm bolts, so you can just take off one and it'll swing out the way. And then you have your tensioner, of course, that sits right here. This is what holds tension on the belt. Take that 14mm off and you'll see the tensioner kind of go in this direction, and it'll loosen up, and then you'll be all set. So now you have access to a free belt, and then you can replace the pulleys as well as the water pump. So, with that said, let's go ahead and carefully take off the timing belt and inspect for damages if you see any damages. But I already know the damages, so that's the reason that we're replacing it here today, because I already did the valve adjustment on both heads. So now it's time for the timing belt. Alright, so now that we have the tensioner and the auto tensioner removed and the belt is also removed, now we need to remove the water pump, which they have a few bolts. We have one bolt here, one here, one over here, another here, another here. That's a dowel pin, so it keeps the water pump in place, and that's it. So before you can take that water pump off, you're gonna have to go ahead and remove this idler pulley, which that one is a 14mm, so we'll remove that now. Alright, so there's that. So now that that's removed, you wanna put a pan or whatever you have underneath your motor, because it's gonna leak fluid. Mine's already leaked out because I tried to take the water pump out first. So go ahead and remove the idler pulley, then you'll be able to remove the water pump. Give it a couple wiggles. As you can see, that is good to go. So now that that's out, here's the old one. Doesn't look too shabby. So at least out with the old, in with the new. So that is fantastico. So everything looks great over here. I don't see any issues at all. So yeah, that looks freaking great. Besides that gasket in here, looks like a gasket. Yeah, that looks like a gasket. So hopefully there's no coolant leaking on the other side of that water tube. I didn't see any when I did the plenum gasket and all that, so I believe it's good, but that gasket looks like it was pinched. You can kind of see the gasket hanging. So I'll have to check on that later on when I remove the intake plenum. You'll see down here, the tube goes straight to the other side of the block on the transmission side. But if it is leaking, you'll be able to see right down here, down below. But we're not worried about that right now. So yes, we have the water pump removed, we have the pulley removed, we have the tensioner and the auto tensioner removed. So now we're gonna go ahead and install everything back in reverse order. So we'll do the water pump, then the pulley, then the tensioner, and then last but not least the auto tensioner, once you've checked for timing marks and making sure that everything is aligned correctly. So with that said, I'm not going to waste anybody's time. I'm going to go ahead and put all the parts back on, and then we'll go ahead and I will show you how to realign it. I gotta put these new parts in. Alright guys, so I finally got the timing belt going, and it is on. However you choose to put it on, you can put it on. The essential thing is to make sure that all the timing marks are lined up. So you can see that is lined up correctly. This notch, and this notch. And then the same on this side. You got a notch right here. Another notch right here. And right here. So this one will have a number 1 for cylinder number 1, which is top dead center if I'm not mistaken. So that's cylinder number 1. This one does not have any cylinder numbers. And then the bottom, as you can see, that is lined up. There is an arrow that I filled in with paint marker, and then I just follow the arrow on the cam. Shoot! I made a mark, and then there's also another arrow on the block. If you guys can see that there. It's hard to focus, but on the block, it has that. And then you wanna, once everything is lined up, then you wanna release your pin, and now you have tension on the tensioner. So it's always gonna have that tension on there. Make sure that your bolts, all of these bolts are all tight on everything, and yeah, you should be good to go. So now we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna rotate the engine a couple times, and then we're gonna check our timing marks. All right, guys, so like I said, now that you have everything timed, you release the pin out of the tensioner, everything's lined up. Now you're gonna rotate it. I like to rotate it 1 time and then recheck the marks, 1 time being 1 full rotation. After you do that, then you could go ahead and make sure, after you do that once and make sure that everything is still lined up, go ahead and spin it a few times, make sure it's nice and smooth and that you do have compression and there's no binding. What I had was paper towel or toilet paper inside the cylinder holes. The spark plugs are out. Makes it easier to crank, and you can hear the compression. You can't tell how much compression there is, but you can hear the compression. And with the paper towels or toilet paper in there, they will blow out if you have good compression, which all the toilet paper on each cylinder, all 6 cylinders, did come out. So that's good news there. So now I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna jump into rotating it and then rechecking it. So let's do that now. Okay, so now that you know all of your marks are lined up, I rotated it once and the lines all still mark up. This lines up, this one lines up, this one lines up, and there's no binding. So now that you've done it once and you know there's no binding, let's consistently spin it a couple times and then check it. So at least 3 or 4 times and then check it, and you should be good. Like I said, you don't want any binding, so if you feel like a lot of binding, then stop immediately. Because there should be some slight resistance, but there shouldn't be a lot. You can just see it moves nice and smoothly, especially with the spark plugs out. I mean, at your compression stroke, yeah, you're gonna have some resistance, but that's because it's at its compression stroke. But as you can see, I'm not over here, you know, jacking on it. I don't need 2 arms. I'm literally doing it with my left hand, and I'm right-handed. So with that said, I think everything here is phenomenal. It's great. It's good to go. So now let's line everything back up. And yep, that lines up, that lines up, and that lines up. So there we have it. I think everything is fantastic. So we're gonna move forward with this, put all the plastics back on, get her up to date, and yeah, we'll get this going and get the swap actually inside the Civic. So that's checked off the list. There's plenty more stuff to do, but this is a big portion of the build that I wanted to get done. So now we got a brand new timing belt, water pump, tensioner, pulley, you name it. Everything on this side is brand new and it's good to go. So let's jump right into it.